known ever since I was a kid. You turn on the news, we're trying to target 2% inflation. We're at 3, we're at 1, but we need to get it back to 2. Some people say inflation is a stealth tax, and that we should not be targeting inflation. Where do you come in that?
The inflation target is, pardon my French, bullshit.
Okay.
And it's supposed to be. It reinforces the idea that the Federal Reserve is a central bank, and therefore it is targeting inflation. It is responsible for inflation, but it simply reinforces what the Federal Reserve actually does, which is try to manipulate opinions and emotions. Ben Bernanke just said recently, because as he wrote his first blog post at Brookings in 2015, he admitted monetary policy is 98% talk. It's actually not. It's 98% bullshit and 2%. The 2% truth is what I'm telling you, which is these private discussions where they worry. We don't know how to measure money. We don't even know what's going on in the monetary system. Someday that's going to bite us in the ass. That's what Greenspan would say all the time in the 1990s. Nobody listened to him. His irrational exuberance speech, for example, 1996. People my age remember that during the dot-com era because they heard irrational exuberance and thought stock market. What he actually said was, we can't measure or even define money, so how would we know if assets are behaving rationally or irrationally? That's what he actually said. So this inflation targeting nonsense is simply to create the illusion that they're in control of all these things they are not in control of. And they just kind of fingers crossed, as long as the correlation between them moving the federal funds rate around a little bit up or down here or there and economic outcomes seems to be relatively plausible, everything seems to be fine. So in the 80s and 90s, it sounded like, Alan Greenspan would raise the federal funds rate 1/4 point, and then growth would kind of slow, or it seemed like it might be slowed, or the economy maintained stability throughout that decade. So maybe moving the federal funds rate around actually had some benefit when it was all just smoke and mirrors. It was all incredible bullshit.
So what does drive it then?
The Eurodollar system. That's the thing.
It's entirely...
Yes. So prosperity, all the stuff of the last 70 years has been, the Eurodollar system is behind it all. Where did the great inflation come from? People don't know that. People think the Fed printed too much money. The Fed doesn't even know what money is. They wouldn't know how to print it. The banking system went nuts in the 60s and 70s, and there was nothing to stop it. So we had the Eurodollar system, the banking system, creating way too much money outside the United States as well as inside the United States. That led to the great inflation. So we have the essentially, especially during the Great Moderation, you have the Federal Reserve essentially taking credit for what the Eurodollar was doing.
Do you have any allies that agree with you on this?
Sure.
You do? We're gonna have to ask Lynn about this.
Mm-hmm.
Who's Lynn? Lynn Alden.
She would disagree.
She would disagree.
Absolutely.
Why would she disagree?
Because she's a traditionalist.
Okay.
You don't have to take my word for it on any of this.
Oh no, of course, but like
I'm talking about you can take the word of Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, Paul Volcker, all Federal Reserve officials going back to the beginning of the Eurodollar system. What they don't say in public and what they actually say in private is exactly what I'm telling you. We have no idea how to do money. When I do presentations, most of my presentation is using quotes from these people. So if you don't believe me because I'm just some funny-looking guy who shows up out of the blue, then take their word for it. The famous quote I use from June of 2000, which was a private internal FOMC discussion, where they were talking about how they're required by law to produce monetary targets, going back to the Humphrey-Hawkins Act in 1977, when Congress realized, hey, all this inflation business is probably money. We should probably have the central bank do something about it, so you're required to produce money targets. And in 2000, we continue to produce these monetary targets we don't use because they're complete crap. M1 and M2 were obsolete in the 60s. So we're producing these monetary targets, and the quote Greenspan said was, the idea that we can base monetary policy on actual money has become a dubious proposition, because he said the proliferation of financial products has been so extreme, we can't define money. And the proliferation of financial products is exactly what I'm saying. How these banks in this internal Eurodollar system actually transact back and forth. The actual forms of liquidity, the forms of assets and liability that go on the banking sheet are things that would blow your mind, like a currency swap. How is a currency swap, a derivative transaction? How is that actual physical currency? How is it like physical currency? Well, it is.
Okay. I'm just going to say what I've heard. Okay, so speaking to people regularly on the podcast, different economists, different analysts will say that the U.S. government or the Fed has expanded the balance sheet by, say, 40%.
Yep.
So
Makes no difference.
it makes no difference.
None.
Why not?
Bank reserves are not money. Bank reserves are an internal token.
But
They have a very limited use, and they can't escape the system. So,
but isn't it a case of again? This is where I'm hugely out of my depth. But they go into the market, they go and buy assets.
Sure.
They print the money to buy the assets.
no.
How do they buy the assets?
They create a live, remember, double accounting. So they have to, they in the quantitative easing or LSAP transaction, from the perspective of the Fed, they increase their balance sheet, which means they buy a bond and add the bond to the asset side and create a remainder called the bank reserve, which is used as an asset for the commercial banks. However, you or I can't get our hands on bank reserves. A company can't get its hands on bank reserves. Bank reserves are only an interbank token that has very limited use inside the banking system or inside the interbank system. So it's not like you or I are going to go into the real economy and use a bank reserve because we can't. Nobody can.
But
so what actually happens?
Do those bank reserves make their way into the Eurodollar system?
No. They're a simple single-use token. Usually their use, at least traditionally, had been to satisfy reserve requirements, but over the last 50 years, reserve requirements don't matter because nobody uses cash liquidity. So there is no need for a reserve requirement. Therefore, reserves are essentially an interbank token to settle, say, gross real-time transactions.
But why would they go and buy these assets then?
For three reasons, none of which are actually legitimate, none of which are money printing. So let's start here. Quantitative easing.
Yeah.
Everybody looks at quantitative easing from the perspective of the Fed's balance sheet, and that's understandable because you think the Fed is an actual central bank. You think it's actually printing money, when in fact you have to look at things from the perspective of the commercial bank they're transacting with. And when you look at the perspective of the commercial bank, after a QE transaction, nothing has changed. So I'm a commercial bank, you're the Fed. I have a U.S. Treasury that you want to buy because you're doing quantitative easing. We'll get to why they want to do quantitative easing in a second. So what happens is I give you the Treasury, you create the bank reserves on your balance sheet, which now I have as an asset. So from my perspective, all that has changed is I've swapped the Treasury for a bank reserve asset. That's it.
What do I do with those bank reserve assets?
Nothing. It's just an inert asset on the balance sheet. So nothing has changed. It's simply an asset swap, and it's not a good one either. So why does the Fed or any central bank do QE if all it is an asset swap for a commercial bank? And the answer is, well, there are three proposed theoretical channels for QE. Again, you don't have to take my word for it. This is not me talking.
No.
This is from the academic scholarship, from the central bankers themselves. They'll tell you there's three theoretical channels for quantitative easing, and none of them are money printing. The first one is interest rates. Because it seems like if I'm buying bonds from the market, I'm the central bank. I'm buying bonds from the market. That should raise the price of those bonds, therefore lowering the interest rate. So theoretically, a central bank coming in and buying an asset raises the price of that asset. And if it's a financial asset like a bond, therefore interest rates go down. And as we've been taught from basically the beginning of Economics 101, we're told to associate lower interest rates with stimulus, which actually isn't true, by the way. Lower interest rates actually signal the opposite of stimulus. But we're all told, remember, this is all psychology, we're all told that lower interest rates are beneficial. So the first theoretical channel is I buy bonds, raise their price, lower their interest rate. That helps the public think that we've stimulated stuff. The second theoretical channel is something called portfolio effects. Portfolio effects are, again, I'm the commercial bank. I just swapped the U.S. Treasury, which actually had a relatively decent return on that asset, for bank reserves, which have a incredibly crappy return. So it's an asset. So I went from a decent return to a crappy return. So what the Fed is expecting is that in order to replace that earning power, I'm going to go into the market and do something and buy a risky bond or actually lend, which is what they're really trying to do. If I take all your treasuries as a commercial bank, I'm hoping you're going to replace them by lending.
Yeah.
Not using the reserves, but using your own balance sheet space to lend because you need to earn a spread in order to remain in business. But what ends up happening in practice is central banks will take safe assets from banks, commercial banks, and then they'll go on the market and buy more and just replace them. So that's the second theoretical channel, which is portfolio effects, or what they call portfolio effects. And then the third one is, believe it or not, sentiment. And the sentimental channel is nothing more than playing upon the public's ignorance about what actually goes on here. If you believe that the expansion of the Fed's balance sheet is inflationary because they're printing money, then the Fed expects that you will act on that belief and you will actually become inflationary. If enough people think that the Fed have printed money, that they all start buying, assets, Bitcoin or other assets to shelter from, that sends a signal to the rest of the economy. Oh, the market expects inflation. Therefore, people in the real economy act as if inflation is going to be coming, because you'll think, well, prices are going to go up. I better start buying stuff now.
Yeah.
You create this self-fulfilling prophecy where you're essentially pulling forward activity to today based on this psychological manipulation, which is nothing more than bullshit. It's all sentiment. So the three theoretical channels of quantitative easing, and guess what? Quantitative easing has been around for over 20 years. The Bank of Japan started with it in March of 2001, so 21 plus years. And guess how much effect they found in those theoretical channels? And I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about academic studies conducted by central banks and other economists. They don't work, none of them. There is no correlation whatsoever between bank reserves and real economic outcomes. And this predates the quantitative easing era. This goes back to Paul Volcker. Again, what I said about in the 1970s and 80s. People have a big misunderstanding what Volcker did. They think he stopped the great inflation by using bank reserves. The idea was if you curtail or constrain the low amount of bank reserves, that would constrain the amount of depository money creation, which then would limit bank credit, which then would limit economic activity and bring inflation back under control. So it was a very simple equation. Limit bank reserves, eventually you create, you restrain the economy through the banking channel. Didn't happen. That's not what happened at all, because there is no correlation between bank reserves, actual effective money, bank credit, and the real economy, because the banking system broke that link between bank reserves and the money they used long before then, decades before we got to the 1970s. So bank reserves are nothing more than a policy byproduct of accounting.
So how does the Eurodollar drive inflation? And what's particularly happened over the last, couple of years that has led to the current high rates of inflation? Because there is a correlation between global pandemic, massive amounts of stimulus, and high inflation. That story, that narrative, it makes sense. It's logical. Well, but you're saying it's not that. You're saying it's Eurodollar. So how is it the Eurodollar that's caused that?
So we've been hearing that ever since the first quantitative easing in the United States back in 2009. They're going to destroy the dollar. They're printing money. Inflation's going to get loose, all this stuff. That didn't just start in 2021. That goes back to 2009. So the Fed doing all that stuff, we did not see any of those things happen. In fact, the dollar has only gone higher. We've seen disinflation, lack of economic growth, lack of recovery up until 2021. So something changed in 2021 that was different from how everything had performed before. The thing that changed was not quantitative easing, nor was it actually government intervention. What actually changed was, as you said, the pandemic, which created all sorts of supply bottlenecks and restrictions. What we've seen over the last year, even today, the CPI report that was just released, which was another 40-year high, is not money printing. It's not even inflation. It's simply a supply shock. The difference between small economics of an inelastic supply curve and a rightward shift in demand, a temporary rightward shift in demand. The only way to balance those two curves is if prices go higher.
Right.
So if more people demand a product and I'm not able to supply as many products as is demand, I can charge more for that same product. Even though I'm selling less of that product, I'll make more money.